Hello, everybody. I hope you're going well. Today, I will show you a pretty nice lesson about the Latvian Gambit. So, this opening is very, very sensitive. The reason is that it is a nice surprise weapon in Blitz chess. In classical, like always, I would recommend you to go for the Queen's Gambit. If you have any more questions about the Queen's Gambit, just let me know in the comment section. Of course, there is a very recent upload about the Queen's Gambit. But also with the black pieces, I would recommend you something more, at least something more solid, like for example the Stafford Gambit. Of course, there is again a lesson about the Stafford Gambit. So the Latvian Gambit is when we start the game with e4, e5, and let's say knight f3, pawn f5. So this opening is very, very, very difficult to handle for someone who doesn't know how to face that with the white pieces. But to be honest, strategically, it is very, very risky for black. So you better watch this video very, very intensively to not lose immediately in the opening. So there are two logical moves in that position. There is knight takes e5, the main line, and and pawn takes f5. So knight takes e5 is very, very interesting because it is, it is a Latvian gambit, but it isn't an accepted variation, neither it is a refused variation. So the line for black is actually queen f6, d4. If the knight goes somewhere else, we can just take on e4, then just go queen e7, defend the pawn, bring the pieces out. It is an easy position to go for. For example, knight c3, knight f6, that's about it. Bishop f5, castles. Very, very aggressive opening, and this is actually a nice line for black. Another line that is possible after, for example, queen f6 is knight c4. Knight c4, I would recommend you again to just take the pawn, defend the pawn, knight f6, playing some logical moves, playing tactical. You have to play dynamic chess, otherwise you are almost lost with the black pieces. But okay, this is, for example, a line that exists. You can rewatch the video in order to find and to put all the moves into your study. But you can see that the main line is super duper tactical. Okay, because at the very least we will get a piece. But okay, it's very, very difficult. There is another move possible. It is f4 to protect the knight after queen f6. So f4, d6, and we take on e4. So if if white accepts you to just take on e4, you're having a good position already, because you will move the queen away and then bring your pieces out, very gently, and that's about it. So of course the main problem is d4. Why is it a problem? Because it is just bring the pieces out. d6, the knight goes back, we can just take on e4, and again we move the queen, to free the f6 square. We bring the pieces out, and that's a good opening, counterattack all the time. So the spirit is just to not care about anything. Knight b4. If white wants to take there, we can at the very least, just go bishop g4 at the very, very, very least. And it isn't a non-sound opening. It's just that if you don't know how to handle it with the white pieces, you can lose. Otherwise, it is probably just equal. Because the moves are very difficult to find, and this is just the spirit of the position, that's difficult. Let's go back, because instead of knight takes e5, there is also another move that is important. It is e takes f5. So e takes f5 is a very nice move, because it is actually the reason why this opening is being played. It is because everybody tends to take on f5. What happens? Boom, e4. We take a lot of space. So there are three moves: knight e4, knight e5, and queen e2. If queen e2, easy peasy, we go queen e7, the knight has to go back, knight c6, and we're having exactly the same position that we had before with knight f6. The pawn will go back. This is just a check, we're just having a very decent position. Queen h3, g6, using the pin, and this is a very straightforward line. I mean, the pawn is weak, we will get the pawn back, and the king isn't unsafe. Why? Because the king is on the dark squares, and if needed, we can always put the bishop on this weak dark square diagonal. And the d-file is closed. If white tries to open up the d-file, then, it is very, very risky. So this is actually a very chaotic variation, but completely playable. That is, it is hurtful to say that, but it is a real weapon. Now, instead of taking on f5, it's possible. I'm sorry. When taking on f5, it's possible that white won't go for queen e2, but for knight e4, putting the king in, putting the knight in the center, defending the f5 pawn, but it doesn't matter. Queen f6, we attack the knight. If you move the knight away, I can just get the pawn back, and if you defend the pawn with, for example, c3, I can just go knight c6, dislodging the knight which is defending f5, for example, knight take, d takes, bishop c4. If g4, then h5. If h3, exactly like in the Queen's Gambit that we saw, boom, we can take on g4. If pawn takes, we get the rook. And if queen takes, then we have bishop f5, and we're just getting the pawn back. We will castle queenside, and black is already completely winning. Why? Because all the pieces are there. This is a weakness, this is weak, this is weak, this is a backwards pawn, this is a strong pawn, and the development is super easy for black. Even 97 in long castles. So, okay, let's go back. It is actually, this is actually very interesting. But another move that exists is actually knight b5. The idea is that if we take on f5, there is knight c7 fork. So what we have to do is actually to be super smart. Boom, queen e5. We are defending the c7 pawn. Knight a6 is completely playable, but after, for example, knight c3, if we take on f5, there is d3, and eventually we can reach a position like that in which white is better developed than black. So that isn't that great. So that is why we have to probably just go for queen e5 again, trying to defend the pawn. But since we go queen e5, we can start with queen e5. If knight c3 now, we will just go for a6, and not knight a6. If the knight goes back, there is d5. We're having a strong center. We would get the pawn on f5. And to show you how winning black is, I will do something that I had to do. I will show you an engine variation. The engine says, sacrifice the knight and hope. I'm not even joking. You can verify that. The engine says, sacrifice the knight and hope. Yeah, that is just very crazy. So a6, knight a3, d5, and the pawn is weak. We will just get it back. Again, if g4, that is always important to point it out, but if g4, we can just go h5, and there is no h3, because again, we can just take on g4, exactly the same problem. The h pawn cannot take back on g4, and if queen g5, if queen g4, then bishop takes f5, and black is just completely winning. Even if we do not have this g4, h5, h3 variation, black is already winning. So that is why queen e5 is the best move, because we will get d5 and get the pawn back with the bishop. So knight e5 is the last move we have to verify. If knight e5, we can just go knight f6, defending the pawn, bishop e2, bishop e7, preparing to castle. And actually, white will go for a very difficult move to face. It is actually bishop h5. It's easy peasy, we go on f8. If, of course, knight takes there, then queen takes h5, and now we're just losing because of checkmate. And if g6, then pawn takes, and there is just a pin, and the game is lost, and it's just checkmate, and that's not good, and la. So, of course, we do not take, we go king f8, and there is nothing. Knight f7, but queen e8. And now if the knight gets the rook, we get the bishop, and the knight is trapped forever. And the threat is actually to take there, so g4 is the only move, but then we can just take on g4. If pawn takes, we get the knight, and if knight h8, we can just retreat the knight to f6, and the knight is still trapped, and we will just get it sooner or later. Yeah, so that is a pretty nice variation to look at. Of course, I have to point it out, but if g5, we can just go d6, because even though pawn takes, bishop takes, this is still a trap piece, and we will still get the pawn back, and we already have a piece, so it doesn't really, we will get a piece for the rook, and we're just having a strong center, and this is actually probably the most difficult variation to look at with the black pieces, because you're just sacrificing an exchange, and you're not better dynamically speaking, but strategically speaking. Why? Because you will attack on the queen side also, with the bishop, which is also defending the king side. So that is not very, easy to feel, but it's just winning. For example, rook d1, knight d4, there are just too many holes on the light squares. So that is why I would recommend you to just practice this position with your coach or with this video, Of course, if you have any more questions, just let me know in the comment section. Yeah, so this is a line that you have to see, you have to know it, because if you don't know this line, it's almost impossible to find queen e8. Or if you see queen e8, it's difficult to say, yeah, I'm almost better if knight takes rook. So yeah, this is what we had to verify on e takes f5. The best variation, again, is probably to take there and to accept all these troubles after d4. But okay, it isn't, such a problem, because like always, if there is anything else, you can always let me know in the comment section. I will be there to answer you. But d6 and we take on e4, and this is already a good position. And okay, the engine, it's important to point it out, because nowadays, every opening has been analyzed by the engine billions of times. The engine doesn't like any opening, especially when the opening is sacrificing a lot, but it doesn't matter, because we are humans and we know which moves are actually complicated to face and which are not. So if you play this opening, just turn the engine on. The engine is in every case useless during the chess game, because you cannot use an engine during your chess games. That was it. Thank you very, very, very much. If you have any more questions, just let me know in the comment section. Subscribe to the channel, share this video, and of course, share your results with this opening. It is important for me to know that the openings that I'm showing you are